Life as a medieval jester wasn't all fun and games. Behind the jokes was a tough job that most people wouldn't want. They had to be smart, fast, and careful with every word. If you think they just made people laugh all day, you're in for a surprise. Kings and nobles didn't just hire anyone who could make silly noises. If that were true, most teenage boys in the kingdom would have been employed at court. They wanted someone clever who could read a room faster than a soldier could draw a sword. A bad joke at the wrong moment could turn a friendly feast into a fight between countries. The job interview for a court jester was nothing like today's applications. Singing was essential, not just casual humming, but ballads and the ability to make up lyrics on the spot. Juggling was practically required. Storytelling abilities were tested thoroughly, as a jester might need to entertain guests for hours during long winter nights. Mimicry was perhaps the most dangerous yet valuable skill. Some jesters became so good at imitating noblemen that guards would sometimes mistake the actual nobles for jesters doing impressions. Not everyone chose to become a jester. Many were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Historical records show that about 1 in 4 jesters began as peasants who caught a noble's eye. Others were captured during wars and gifted to courts, a human present wrapped in bells and colorful clothing. One dark aspect of jester history was the exploitation of people with physical differences or disabilities. Individuals with unusual features were sometimes forced into jester roles against their will. Courts across Europe, Asia, and the Middle East all have records of this cruel practice. The lucky ones were those who had actual training. These entertainers would travel from court to court with prepared routines. They were medieval comedians, except with higher stakes. Instead of being booed off stage, they risked being thrown in a dungeon if the king didn't laugh. Getting hired didn't guarantee a good life. You became the kingdom's walking entertainment system and verbal punching bag. Being woken at 3 in the morning because the king had a nightmare and needed cheering up was just part of the job. Jesters had to constantly understand the complex politics of court life. Records suggest the average jester lasted only about 4 years in service before being dismissed, running away, or meeting an unfortunate end. For those who did succeed, there were rewards beyond just staying alive. A clever joke at the right moment could earn you surprising benefits. After all, when you're the only one allowed to mock the king without losing your head, you better hope there's something worthwhile in your pay sack at the end of the week. So you've made it into the royal court as a jester. Congratulations! Your wardrobe now consists of mismatched clothes in bright colors, you wear a hat with bells, and your new boss can have you thrown into a dungeon on a whim. But at least you're getting paid, right? Some court jesters actually had it pretty good. They earned a regular wage, got food prepared by royal cooks, enjoyed a dry place to sleep, and received clothing, though usually clothing that looked like a rainbow exploded. The typical jester outfit wasn't exactly something you'd wear to impress a date, unless your date had a strong fondness for bells and pointed shoes. According to records from medieval European courts, a well-established jester could earn roughly the same as a mid-level craftsman. In England during the 1300s, royal account books show several jesters earning between 10 and 20 pounds per year, when a common laborer might earn only 2 pounds annually. The real money wasn't in the base salary. It was in the bonuses. A well-loved jester could get generous perks. One jester in England was rewarded with his own piece of land after making the king laugh during a political crisis. The land grant specified it was given for services of merriment and good counsel. Another court fool received an unusual but valuable form of payment: beer. Records from a German court show a jester received 1 gallon of beer per day every day for life. That's 365 gallons annually, enough to ensure his jokes got funnier as the evening wore on, at least in his own mind. Royal gifts sometimes included jewelry, gold coins, or even livestock. But these rewards only applied to jesters who worked for kings who actually liked them. If you messed up, your reward might be a night in the dungeon, or worse, a swift promotion to the executioner's guest list. Payment varied dramatically depending on the court. A jester in a wealthy kingdom might earn more than some minor nobles, while one in a smaller household might receive nothing more than food scraps and an itchy bed near the horses. Some jesters discovered that sleeping near horses meant they weren't the smelliest performer in the castle. Small comforts matter when you're at the bottom of the social ladder. Most jesters couldn't save enough to retire comfortably. They remained dependent on their royal patrons until they could no longer perform. They couldn't retire rich unless they were very smart about saving their money, very funny for a very long time, or very lucky. But for all their clever jokes and political savvy, jesters needed to do more than just make people laugh to earn their keep. Their job went far beyond simple comedy. What exactly did a medieval jester do all day? The answer, far more than just crack jokes. Court jesters were the Swiss Army knife of medieval entertainment. They needed multiple skills just to survive the week. First and foremost, jesters had to master several performing arts. They needed to sing ballads, play instruments ranging from simple drums to complex lutes, and dance elaborate routines that told stories or mocked current events. One English court record describes a jester who performed a dance so wild that he seemed possessed by 20 spirits, each more merry than the last. Tumbling and physical stunts were crowd favorites. Many jesters could perform backflips, handstands, and splits, abilities that became especially impressive after the 8th round of ale had been served at dinner. The more talented jesters developed signature moves that the court would request by name. Animal imitations ranked surprisingly high on the job requirements. Court records from France describe a jester who could mimic 14 different animals, from rooster calls to wolf howls. His bear impression was supposedly so convincing that hunting dogs would bark in alarm whenever he performed it. Puppetry and sound effects were also essential jester talents. Small puppet shows allowed them to tell stories that might be too politically dangerous to act out themselves. Some jesters became famous for their ability to mimic the sounds of battle, storms, or even the queen snoring. Though that last one could earn you a night in the dungeon if Her Majesty didn't find it amusing. But entertainment was only part of the job. Court jesters also served as message carriers between nobles, especially when those messages needed to be delivered with care. Bad news became slightly less bad when wrapped in a joke or a song. Medieval courts used jesters to announce tax increases, battle losses, or diplomatic insults because the messenger was less likely to be punished if everyone was laughing. The hardest part of the job might have been serving as the emotional outlet for the nobility. When kings or lords felt frustrated, bored, or angry, they often summoned their jesters to distract them. These situations were like defusing a bomb while juggling and singing. One wrong move, and things could explode. The role of scapegoat fell to jesters more often than they would have liked. If a nobleman spilled his drink, the jester might be blamed for distracting him. If a lady tripped, surely it was because the jester's performance made her dizzy. This blame game allowed nobles to save face by redirecting embarrassment. The best jesters turned this demanding job into a position of unusual influence. They became trusted companions who could speak truths others couldn't. They reminded kings of their humanity and helped diffuse tensions during heated moments. A jester who could make a furious king laugh during a tantrum might prevent decisions that would otherwise lead to bloodshed. This unusual combination of entertainer and trusted advisor created a strange kind of respect. While openly mocked for their appearance and behavior, skilled jesters were secretly valued for their wisdom and insight. And speaking of saying things others couldn't, the jester's ability to speak truth to power was perhaps their most dangerous yet valuable talent of all. Here's something that might surprise you about medieval courts. While most people would be executed for insulting the king, the court jester could openly mock him, and sometimes even get rewarded for it. This wasn't just an accident, it was actually part of the jester's job. Medieval kings weren't exactly known for taking criticism well, yet somehow the jester could point out the king's mistakes, make fun of his appearance, or question his decisions, as long as they did it in a way that made people laugh. This freedom of speech came with strict, unwritten rules. The jester had to be clever about delivery. Criticism hidden inside a funny story? Perfect. An insulting joke with a flattering twist at the end? Even better. A straight-up insult without any humor? That would get even a jester thrown in the dungeon. Or worse. Royal court records from across Europe contain fascinating examples of jesters who mastered this delicate art. In England, a jester gained fame for his annual performance that mocked the king's financial policies. Each year, on a specific holiday, he would perform an elaborate dance, recite a rhyme about taxes being too high, and end with a perfectly timed, well, let's call it a controlled release of gas. Yes, this jester literally earned land and gold by performing a dance that ended with a fancy fart aimed at royal tax policies. In the French court, historical accounts tell of a jester who once entered a royal meeting wearing a crown made of straw. When asked by the angry king what he was doing, the jester replied, "Practicing to be you, your majesty. You've been acting so foolish lately that soon we might need to trade hats." Instead of executing him, the king reportedly laughed and reconsidered his recent decisions. These weren't just amusing performances, they served a vital purpose in medieval governance. Kings were surrounded by people who constantly told them what they wanted to hear. In this environment, the jester became the only reliable source of honest feedback. Some rulers actively relied on their jesters for this reason. When you're the only one who can tell the king he looks ridiculous without being thrown in a river, you either learn timing or learn swimming. Several medieval memoirs written by royal advisors mention consulting with the court jester before bringing bad news to the king, hoping to learn the safest approach. But this unique freedom wasn't without risk. The protection wasn't perfect. Numerous accounts exist of jesters who went too far, read the room wrong, or simply caught the king on a bad day. Learning to tell jokes was the easy part of being a jester. Learning exactly when to stop was what kept you alive. Documents from various courts describe punishments ranging from beatings to imprisonment for jesters whose jokes crossed the line. Some disappeared from court records entirely after particularly bold performances, their fates unrecorded but easily guessed. The truly successful jesters developed an almost supernatural ability to sense moods and read subtle cues. This skill wasn't just about survival, it made them surprisingly influential. While court jesters with their unique position sometimes shaped kingdom decisions, those without royal protection faced a much harsher reality beyond the castle walls. Not every jester was lucky enough to score a job at the royal court. For every entertainer who wore fancy bells and ate food prepared by royal cooks, there were dozens who performed in village squares, dusty roads, and dirty taverns just to earn enough for their next meal. These wandering jesters lived a completely different life than their court counterparts. Court jesters worried about pleasing one boss, the king. Wandering jesters had to please everyone, everywhere, all the time, and medieval crowds weren't exactly known for their polite feedback. Traveling performers moved from town to town carrying everything they owned. Their stage was wherever people gathered, marketplaces, tavern yards, or village greens. They performed rain or shine, summer heat or winter freeze. Many wandering jesters died young from exposure to harsh weather or diseases caught while traveling. Unlike court jesters who received regular meals, wandering entertainers ate based on how well they performed that day. People threw coins if you were good, and rocks if you weren't. Nothing improves your juggling skills quite like knowing that failure means both hunger and a head injury. Records from medieval town councils show that wandering performers were rarely welcomed by local authorities. Many towns had laws forbidding masterless men from staying more than 1 or 2 nights. This meant constant travel, sleeping in barns, under wagons, or in ditches by the roadside. Some jesters joined traveling groups of entertainers that performed at seasonal festivals, markets, and occasionally at minor noble houses. Traveling in numbers provided some safety, but also meant splitting the already meager earnings. Performing for commoners rather than nobles brought its own challenges. Crowds were often drunk, rowdy, and quick to turn violent if not entertained. A court jester might fear the dungeon for a bad joke, but a street performer feared the immediate fist of a disappointed farmer with arms the size of tree trunks. To survive, wandering jesters needed an incredible memory. They had to learn hundreds of jokes, songs, and stories suitable for different regions. What got laughs in one village could start a fight in the next due to local rivalries or different dialects. Health problems were perhaps the biggest challenge. If you were sick or injured, no one cared. There was no sick leave, no disability payments. You either performed or went hungry. Many jesters developed chronic ailments from years of physical stunts, exposure to the elements, and inadequate nutrition. Competition was fierce and sometimes deadly. Prime performing spots in busy markets or during festivals were fought over, sometimes literally. When your entire livelihood depends on standing in exactly the right spot at the right time, you defend that spot fiercely. Despite these hardships, some wandering jesters achieved remarkable success. A few became famous enough that towns would actually pay them to visit. Others developed such unique skills that wealthy merchants would hire them for private events. For most, however, life as a wandering jester meant existing one joke away from disaster, with no safety net if the punchline fell flat. While court jesters worried about keeping their heads, traveling performers worried about keeping their teeth, both from angry audiences and from the simple lack of food. Jesters had no special immunity to disease. Despite their colorful clothes and quick wit, they caught lice, fleas, fevers, and worse, just like everyone else in medieval times. In fact, their lifestyle often puts them at even greater risk than the average person. Court jesters lived in castles, which might sound great until you learn what medieval castles were actually like. Real medieval castles were cold, damp, and crawling with vermin. Rats scurried through the halls, bringing fleas and disease. Drafty windows let in rain and snow. Smoke from fireplaces filled the rooms because chimneys were poorly designed. Medical records from royal households reveal that respiratory illnesses were extremely common among court staff, including jesters. One medieval doctor wrote that he could identify castle servants by their cough alone, noting that jesters had the most distinctive hack because they needed to clear their throats before performances. Some jesters were even forced to entertain plague victims to lift spirits during outbreaks. Court records from the 1400s mention jesters being sent to perform in quarantine areas, a job assignment that basically amounted to a death sentence. Few returned from these grim performances. Food safety didn't exist as a concept in medieval times. Jesters ate what everyone else ate: partially spoiled meat, vegetables grown in human waste, and bread that often contained fillers to make flour go further. Water was usually unsafe to drink, which is why even breakfast often included beer or wine instead. It's hard to be funny first thing in the morning, but it's even harder when you're slightly drunk because your morning cup of water would have given you deadly diarrhea. Dental problems were particularly hard on jesters. How do you make people laugh when you're dealing with an abscess tooth? There were no dentists, just barbers who would pull rotting teeth without painkillers. Court records mention payments to barbers for treating jesters' dental problems, suggesting this was a common issue. For traveling jesters, health risks multiplied. Sleeping outdoors or in crowded, filthy inns exposed them to even more diseases. They walked miles between towns, developing blisters that could become infected. Winter travel meant frostbite. Summer meant heat stroke. Despite these health challenges, or perhaps because of them, jokes about illness, death, and bodily functions were actually popular in medieval times. People used dark humor to cope with the constant presence of disease and death. Poop jokes weren't just for children. They were high comedy when everyone regularly witnessed the horror of dysentery. Jesters who could find humor in these grim realities became especially valued. One thing people always remembered was who made them laugh when everything else was falling apart. Records show that during the worst plague outbreaks, rulers would keep their jesters close, not just for entertainment, but for emotional support. A jester who could make jokes while the world seemed to be ending earned a special kind of respect. In a world filled with disease, a jester's job was to make light of misery, even when that misery was knocking on their own door. All performances eventually end. For medieval jesters, growing old meant facing a harsh truth. No retirement homes existed for court fools. Once knees became too stiff for cartwheels or voices too scratchy for singing, professional foolery days were numbered. Documents from the 1400s reveal that over 2/3 of court jesters simply vanished from castle payment records after reaching their 40s, considered elderly in medieval times. Unlike craftspeople who could teach apprentices or farmers who could switch to easier tasks, aging jesters had few choices. Their entire value depended on quick thinking and physical ability, qualities that faded with time. A fortunate minority managed to stay in castles with less demanding roles. Court records mention former jesters becoming storytellers for noble children once tumbling became impossible. Others became keepers of entertainment traditions, teaching younger performers the jokes and songs that had pleased previous rulers. Some court fools saved enough coins to open taverns, where customers had to pay for drinks, whether they laughed at the jokes or not. Finally, a captive audience. Religious houses occasionally accepted former entertainers, especially those who had performed in church plays or could read and write. The switch from making bawdy jokes to copying religious texts represented quite the career change. One monastery document mentions a former jester who couldn't stop drawing funny faces in the margins of sacred books. For those without savings or royal favor, choices were bleak. Some joined traveling performers as costume makers. Others became beggars using their skills to attract pity coins. A number ended up as village wise fools, strange characters who survived on community kindness while offering occasional entertainment and odd wisdom. Castle account books rarely mention payments to retired jesters. King Henry of England provided yearly money to an elderly court fool. £6 annually, enough for basic food and shelter, but little else. Such generosity was extremely uncommon. Most rulers simply replaced aging entertainers with younger, livelier performers. When you spent decades making nobles laugh about getting old and feeble, the joke eventually became your life story. Perhaps the saddest part was how quickly even famous jesters were forgotten. Their purpose was creating memorable moments, yet history kept few of their achievements. We know more about ordinary servants than the people who kept powerful rulers entertained during wars and disasters. The end for most jesters wasn't recorded with importance. No special graves were built, no songs remembered them. The court simply continued with someone new. The fresh ruler wanted a different fool with original jokes. And yesterday's star performer might be found begging at the castle gate. A sudden fall for someone who once commanded attention in royal halls. While the jester's career began with laughter, it often finished in silence, showing that medieval entertainment truly ranked among history's most difficult and thankless professions.